The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local journalism today at chly.ca/donate. Local news doesn't survive without local support.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Nanaimo is looking to get more active on bringing non-market housing to the community. The city's Governance and Priorities Committee voted Monday in favor of recommending City Council send $75,000 to the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation to facilitate a non-market housing delivery system pilot. The Prosperity Corporation is the city's economic development agency. They've made a pitch to work with the external Anchor Corporation and the Housing Nanaimo Working Group to create a housing lab, with the goal of bringing non-market housing to Nanaimo. The initial ask was for $300,000, but city procurement policies don't allow that much money to be given out to a corporation like Anchor without a competitive bid process. Midcoast Morning previously reported on this issue in the spring when the partners first came before Nanaimo City Council. You can find that episode on our website, chly.ca/midcoastmorning. For more on this latest development, I spoke with Colin Stansfield, CEO of the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation. What exactly is the ultimate goal of what you're trying to do around non-market housing?
Right. And so the ultimate goal is for us to make sure that we are delivering on the workforce housing that we would define as non-market and missing middle housing that Nanaimo needs in order to support its growth. And so recognizing that housing is economic infrastructure, that there's incredible amounts of work being done in different parts of the housing continuum. What we've seen and what has shown up in City of Nanaimo reports and what we know to be true is that it's getting harder and harder for working folk to find a place to live affordably. And it's been really hard for the City of Nanaimo and its partners to deliver on that. And so what we're attempting to do here is to find a sustainable delivery model for that workforce housing.
And so the Prosperity Corporation is involved in that. The Nanaimo Housing Working Group is involved in that. And then there's this group external to Nanaimo, the Anchor Corporation. How exactly did you come to work with them, and what are they kind of bringing to the equation?
Sure. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's important what you're saying there, and that this is a whole of community response to this issue. And so recognizing that no one group can do it alone. You have the city and everything that it brings in terms of, development permits, sometimes bringing land to the equation, an incredible staff team that is working very hard to move forward social housing. There's this Housing Nanaimo Working Group that is a self-started group of volunteers representing a number of housing providers, industry professionals, developers, the Economic Development Agency, credit unions, group of folk who see this as a challenge and wanted to come together to say, how might we do this together? And then the Prosperity Corporation, we show up, again, as I mentioned, sort of saying, housing is critical economic infrastructure. We want to see workforce housing in town. And so we've agreed to play host for this. And then Anchor is, they would call themselves an extended enterprise. They're a group of companies that have been working in the housing space globally. And what they've come across is a way to move forward what they would call an integrated delivery model for housing that pulls together new forms of capital and financing, that thinks about new construction methods, thinks about the ways that local governments can support and enhance the delivery of housing, but also the community infrastructure that is necessary to move those projects forward. And so they become a facilitator of that process. And that's really what's been, I think, missing, or was something that we haven't tried yet here in Nanaimo, but is popular in communities across the province, across the country. You hear about these housing labs that have started up. I think there's one called, the Balanced Housing Solutions in North Van. There's things that CMHC has put forward, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. This notion of how does one get into an action lab to put these ideas into practice? And that's what Anchor's expertise is in this. And so helping us as a community to see how we pull all of our existing assets together in pursuit of that common objective.
And so in the spring, all of the partners involved in this kind of came before City Council, and there was an ask for, could you fund us to the tune of $300,000 so we can get a pilot off the ground, with the goal of trying to bring 300 to 400 non-market homes to the city within a year or so of that starting. this latest development is that the city took a look at its procurement policies and said, well, the most you can give to any one group without having a competitive bid process is $75,000. So this committee has recommended that they give your group $75,000. Could you tell me a bit about what your vision is for that money? What does that allow you to maybe do?
Yeah, and so to be clear, the decision at the GPC meeting yesterday was an agreement in principle to allow the NPC, the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation, to host a first phase of work. And so it becomes a bit of a new conversation around what is the right phasing of work. And so the procurement piece certainly was one part of the conversation, but I think really the thrust of yesterday was to say, what does it take to get going on this? That if what we're recognizing here is there is a need for an integrated delivery model, by which I mean no one organization can deliver on this alone, and we have to bring all these pieces to the table. How might we do that in a way that is accountable and that is responsible? And so I think what was recognized at the committee table yesterday is that the Prosperity Corporation was created as just that sort of model. It is a partnership between the city and Nanaimo and our Port Authority, our Airport Commission, our Chamber of Commerce, and VIU. It is meant to be one of those tables where we can host those whole of community responses. And so in terms of how exactly that work gets phased out, and without attempting to sort of dodge the question, that's what we're left to sort of figure out right now is what are those first steps. But I think it's absolutely true that we can action a great deal of the items that were in the broader vision. And whether that's just bringing all of the groups together to be able to map out those assets, what to do, a survey of different available land parcels, not just those that are owned by the city, but land that could exist with other institutional partners or different faith and community service groups. If that's looking at different builders, particularly, construction expertise that exists on the island, in BC, across the country, globally, there are new construction methods that align with BC Building Code that could be brought to play here. There are new financial models. You heard in the conversation yesterday, what would it look like to perhaps launch a green bond in the city that allows people to invest in the creation of this housing? And then parts around what is then the long-term, operating model for this? What is the right vehicle? And so all of that exploration can absolutely be done in a first phase. And I think what my takeaway from yesterday is this isn't saying, let's put another $100,000 towards a study of what might be possible. It's let's get working on this. The notion of a housing action lab that says we can get those pieces put together. We can build that relational capital between the different parts of the system. We should be able to identify a first plot and get running on a pilot.
Now, the staff report that was provided to Nanaimo City councillors on this issue at Monday's meeting said in it that it's worth noting that the option to explore a municipal housing authority remains, and if council wanted to take serious steps into the provision of housing, it would be worth directly re-examining the feasibility of such a service. You're talking about a housing action lab. Have you considered a municipal housing authority? Are those different things? What is the kind of context you'd want to share on that?
I think one can absolutely lead to the other. And so part of engaging in a lab process is that you are entertaining all of those how might we questions. And so something that we would absolutely explore is, what is the difference between a land trust, a municipal housing corporation, or an asset development corporation? And it might be that in that order, they're each able to achieve bigger and greater outcomes without losing any of the subsidiary possibilities. And so in a municipal housing corporation, your sole focus might be housing, and it might be that the municipality is the only shareholder. One could also imagine a broader asset development corporation, where now all of a sudden you're getting into commercial and industrial lands. You can see development corporations that own their own utilities. You're starting to be able to welcome in other partners to manage a broader portfolio of assets. And often in that case, there are greater revenue generating opportunities that again allow for better subsidization of, for instance, non-market housing units. And so these are things that can be explored, but explored in the context of this action lab. And so not just looking at one, ultimately, a municipal delivery vehicle for the housing, looking at something that brings in more partners. And so one specific revisiting of could we have a housing corporation is just one conversation. The ability to look at the right vehicle after you've already explored who are the right partners, what are the assets that we're bringing to bear, what are the financial models that exist to fund this. It's sort of putting the right questions in the right order, and that's where the lab process is so valuable.
So it sounds like there is a current to this that is, we're going to spend money to sort of figure out what is the best way to get new non-market housing in the community as quickly as we can. And there's also a current of this that sounds like, maybe we'll do that work and we'll discover that a municipal housing authority might be a good way to do that. How do you kind of line up the part of this that is like, we're figuring out what the best way to do this is? How do you square that with your stated intention of, we want to have this pilot project, we want to get new housing built quickly. The goal is this super ambitious sounding 300 homes within a year.
Right. And I mean, 300 homes in a development stage within a year. Like, our people aren't necessarily moving in within a year. Just to coach some of that, I want to be super ambitious. I want to have those big, hairy, audacious goals, but we also want to be relentlessly practical in this. And I think, Joe, what it's about is not just spending time to study. It's about learning with your hands. And I think that that's really what comes of these lab processes. And so it's a small investment into practical R&D. And that's what we're taking off with here. And so I think yesterday was a endorsement from the committee in principle to get behind that, to say that this is a wonderful complement to the work that the city is already doing in other areas of the spectrum, that recognizes the contribution of so many different community players who have shown up and said that they are personally and organizationally invested in this. And where the Prosperity Corporation comes into this is us saying, we are already an entity that exists, that we can host this conversation, that we can provide the responsibility and the accountability to make sure that it is done well. Because otherwise, what sometimes you see happen in other communities is you launch into creating something wholly new that comes with a whole bunch of extra additional costs and startup time. We're saying, don't create the new thing till you absolutely have to. It's kind of like, I think sometimes you hear people say, I want to launch a cooperative. I want to launch a social enterprise. And they're just talking about launching incorporation models. Like, what is it that you're looking to achieve? What is the right incorporation model to achieve that end then? And so this is where we're sort of saying, let's get together. Let's bring the people in the room. Let's make sure that they're all working together, that we have the construction technology, we have the financing, we have the different ways of community organizing, we have the permitting and the approval, everyone in a room together, focused on that same end that is this workforce housing as non-market and missing middle housing.
On Monday's meeting, it seemed like there was still some uncertainty and possibly even some wrinkles created by the city's procurement process, just based on the fact that, the ask initially was for $300,000 to do this work, that you could only really get $75,000 without this needing to go to a competitive bid process. There were questions around, like, if we give you and sort of ostensibly anchor this money now, does that complicate if the council decides they do want to fund you more later? What's your understanding of how that all fits together?
Well, at first, this is absolutely then saying, hey, we have these good procurement policies in place for a reason. Let's make sure that we are using those and we are honoring those. And so it's doing just that. In terms of creating any wrinkles, I mean, a little bit of the too soon to say, because this just sort of ostensibly chunks work into different phases. And so now it's about looking at that. But it might be that we're no longer requiring the same amount from the city, that you're able to pull in or in one chunk at one time. Joe, again, I'm not trying to sidestep the question. It's sort of reimagining how this work unfolds. And this was hey, let's make that critical first investment, that catalytic first investment in getting this running. And now it's sort of on us to bring the other partners to the table. And when I say on us, I mean the Housing Nanaimo Working Group, Anchor, NPC, the city, all those partners who have stood up and said, we want to see a new approach to the delivery of those non-market units that are in Nanaimo's housing target order, right? That, like, when you look at Nanaimo's reports on that target order, you see that we are over delivering on the aggregate number of units. It's a very specific part of that where we haven't figured it out yet. And this is an investment in figuring that out. Where there's been a goose egg, how can we turn that to 300 to 400 units and ultimately to thousands of units, so that you have a sustainable delivery model for the workforce housing that is so necessary in our community?
assuming that Nanaimo City Council doesn't revisit or revise the decision it's made at this committee meeting, what is your next step on this file? What is the next action you intend to take, and how can people keep up with the process?
Right. I mean, anytime people are interested in keeping up with processes connected to the Prosperity Corporation, I would say, visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter. We are very, I think, clear and transparent communicators of the work that we are endorsing and amplifying and supporting and leading ourselves in the community. So absolutely follow along with us that way. In terms of the next step of the work, I mean, already by 6 a.m. this morning, it's emails flying back and forth to say, okay, what does this look like? How quickly can we get the people together? How do we start to then deliver on the part of the endorsement yesterday was, again, an endorsement in principle. And so it's actually on us now in the immediate to sort of satisfy that condition that says, okay, with $75,000 investment in getting this going, here's what we can deliver to make sure that there is value for that 75. Here's how we will attract other sources of capital. Here's how we will build out the model in a first phase. And so the first bit of the work is really to satisfy that in principle, so that it moves from in principle to an actual investment into this process.
When would you be hoping, in the ideal or maybe even just the practical timeline, that all of this could lead to some kind of proposal or non-market housing in development in Nanaimo?
Oh, great question, Joe. I hesitate to give. If wishes were fishes, hey, I'd be coming back to you next month saying, look at this, we found a piece of property in front. That ain't what's going to happen. But if you're asking me about being wishful, I think it's absolutely realistic that there'll be work done in earnest over the next 6 weeks of the summer to make sure that as soon as everybody's back from vacation in September, we hit the ground running with, this is what a first phase project looks like, and we're all in meetings. If that means that we're closing out December 31st, 2026 with an identified piece of property, some very high likelihood on which different construction techniques could be used, sources of finance that have been identified, if not secured, that would feel like a really good outcome by the end of the year. But recognize that, this is you and me connecting 24 hours after the meeting and me just sort of being wishful. I wish that we had started doing this, 15, 20 years ago, but it's that notion of when's the best time to plant a tree, right? It was 20 years ago. The next best moment is right now. And that's the moment that we're in. This is that next best moment. So we're all committed to this. We're going to be working on it in earnest as fast as we can.
Well, Colin Stansfield, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today, and we'll keep our eyes peeled.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate the time and the interest.
Colin Stansfield is CEO of the Nanaimo Prosperity Corporation.
Midcoast Morning is part of our nonprofit newsroom project, supported by listeners like you. Keep this program on the air by funding it today with a monthly sustaining donation at chly.ca/donate. We've got tote bags and shirts if you need an incentive.
We're talking about the future of non-market housing in Nanaimo on today's program. This week, a City Council committee recommended sending $75,000 to the city's Economic Development Agency for a non-market housing delivery system pilot. We heard a bit about that plan earlier on in the program. A staff report provided to City Council at Monday's meeting said it was worth noting that the option to explore a municipal housing authority remains. And if Council wanted to take serious steps into the provision of housing, it would be worth directly re-examining the feasibility of such a service. A municipal housing authority is a corporation owned by a local government with the purpose of procuring and running non-market housing. They exist in several communities in BC, including Whistler and Burnaby. Further down the island, a local government-owned corporation has been working on non-market housing since the early 1980s. The Capital Region Housing Corporation is owned by its local regional district government. It has a mission to develop and manage affordable housing within the capital region for low to moderate income households. Jeremy Caradonna is a Victoria City Councillor and the Vice Chair of the Housing Corporation.
If you follow the funding for affordable housing, a lot of it in this province gets back to two places. It gets back to BC Housing, or it gets back to CMHC, and really mainly BC Housing. So there's different funding envelopes over time. There's different types of programs. And so two of the ones that we've been relying on pretty heavily in recent years have been Regional Housing First, which is meant to be a pathway for folks who are moving up from shelter and supportive housing into non-supported affordable housing, like what we call deep subsidy housing. So that is a program between the province and the feds and non-market housing providers such as us, Regional Housing First program. So we're building some of those buildings right now. In fact, Village on the Green in Victoria is under construction right now. And those buildings have an 80%, 20% split. So 20% of the units are deep subsidy and 80% are what we call market affordable. And the market affordable help to offset the deep subsidy costs. And then the other main funding envelope is called CHF, Community Housing Fund, that unfortunately the province this year just paused. But that was the main financing mechanism for a lot of the affordable housing that's being built right now across the province. And those buildings are usually 20, 50, 30. So 20% deep subsidy, 50% rent geared to income, and 30% market affordable. So there's different levels of affordability in a lot of these buildings. And that's done for both social reasons and financial reasons.
If you were to explain to someone who's maybe coming into this issue and it's all new to them and they know that BC Housing exists, they know the CMHC exists, what would you tell them as far as the role of a municipal or a regional housing corporation in getting affordable housing built? Like, why does that need to exist, or what does that specifically help with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that government-run non-market housing providers have a leg up against the NGOs. So the NGOs are Greater Victoria Housing Society, Threshold, Pacifica, on and on and on. Macola, there's tons of them. They don't have access to taxpayers, frankly, right? Like whether you're the city of Nanaimo or the city of Victoria, you have access to taxes. If you're the RDN or CRD, you have access to requisition, which is another form of taxation. So we are able to use our requisition authority at the CRD when we need to aid the budget. So that is a massive leg up that the NGOs don't have. The catch exists both for government and non-government, non-market housing providers, which is that at the end of the day, you have to figure out where the capital costs are going to come from to build these buildings. These buildings are expensive to build, right? I mean, we just opened Caledonia. That's a 158 unit building, CHF project, the 2050-30 I was telling you about. That building costs $76 million. So, and not only does it cost $76 million, but it comes with a multi-decade operating subsidy. I think it's 60 years for that one, where BC Housing says we will commit to subsidizing that building for many decades. And it remains on their books for a really long time. And with the financial crunch that we're in and inflation and construction costs, I think it's getting harder and harder for senior governments to make those kinds of commitments. And so everything's kind of paused right now, right? So we're waiting to hear more from the feds on Build Canada Homes and what's going on with CMHC. But we have a bunch of projects in the works. But once those are done, things might really dry up for us in terms of our ability to build new to develop new buildings. So if I were the RDN or if I were the city of Nanaimo, I were doing a kind of a business case analysis on setting up a non-market housing corporation, the number one question I would have, well, there's two questions I would have. One would be about operational capacity and FTEs, like who's actually going to do the work. Like we have a lot of staff at the CRD that work only on the housing corporation. It's a lot of work because remember, you're owning and operating buildings. You are the landlord. So we have tenant management all the time. You know, if your stove breaks, we're the ones dealing with that. Think about it. We have 4,500 tenants. So there's always issues to deal with. So there's staffing capacity challenges. And then the other one is understanding where the capital costs and operating subsidies are going to come from, right? Because right now, BC Housing is like paused their main program. So you might have this shiny new housing corporation that you set up that's run by the city of Nanaimo, but there's no dollars flowing into it. And you're not going to requisition yourself or tax your way to the point of being able to build a $76 million building. That's just it's not realistic. The capital costs really have to come from senior governments. And if I could add a bit more, is that once you have a portfolio, things change, right? Like at the CRD, we own 54 properties. Therefore, we have equity. We're able to leverage that equity. We have like a lot of buildings that are relatively low density, kind of townhome style, leaky condo era, but you're sitting on like an acre of land. That acre of land is worth money. So we're able to leverage our own equity to redevelop properties sometimes. And then also, sometimes the operating subsidies run out. Eventually they run out after a number of decades. And then the building is just self-financed through rents, right? That said, we have massive unfunded liabilities, which is a whole other story I could get into. But once you have a portfolio, you have more options to leverage your equity. But if you're brand new, the city of Nanaimo doesn't own any buildings right now. So they're not in a position to be able to redevelop things that they already have. They're starting from scratch. So those are the two main questions. It's like, who's going to pay for these buildings? And how are you going to staff up and be able to operate and be a good tenant? Because, we are on some level competing with the private market now, especially in market affordable. And we have to be good landlords.
What is your experience working on this file in the capital region a little bit? What does it make you think about how you would approach the issue of trying to bring affordable housing to your community if you had to start from scratch and there was no regional housing corporation that dated back to the 80s?
Yeah, it's a good question and a daunting one. I mean, I think that it would be a multi-year process, and I would be taking a really hard look at the finances, right? I mean, the city of Victoria has a lot of development demand, right? We're not like Burnaby, where it's just like, here's the next 60-story condo tower coming in, but we definitely have a lot of development. But a lot of our development is geared towards rental, and rental is considered an amenity in and of itself. So we don't charge what used to be called community amenity contributions, CACs, and are now known as AACs, amenity or ACCs, amenity cost charges, which just last year became much more regulated. Sorry, let me back up a bit. It used to be sort of the Wild West in BC, where if you're building a building, it wasn't really well defined in legislation, and cities could essentially charge condo developers to essentially pay the piper to be able to build in that city, and with the land lift and all the value that comes with that. And so cities were making a lot of money off CACs, including the city of Victoria. And we were funneling them into our housing reserve fund, which we would then use to co-invest in non-market housing projects. And Burnaby and Vancouver and Coquitlam and Surrey have like taken this to the next level, where it's just tens of millions of dollars come in. So they're sitting on a war chest to be able to finance some of the capital costs of building their own non-market housing. That's great. But I don't know if Nanaimo has the development demand. Is anyone building 30, 40, 50-story condo towers right now? Probably not that many. I'm guessing in Nanaimo, maybe some, not that many. So if you don't have that cash cow of condos that help to capitalize housing reserve funds or housing corporation, you're probably looking mainly at the province and maybe at CMHC. And they've become really tight-pursed lately, right? So that's going to be the big issue that I'd have them look at. I mean, so that's what I would be doing. I mean, I think it's a very noble endeavor, and I think that it adds a lot of value to the community. I'm sounding like a little bit negative here, and I don't mean to. It's just that the money has to come from somewhere. But if you ask me, like, what's my experience been? It's been incredibly rewarding. I mean, we have, again, 4,500 people living on our buildings. Most of those people cannot afford to live in Victoria or in the greater Victoria area. We have buildings all across CRD without having those subsidized rents, right? We have everyone from people who have just moved up from shelter and supportive housing, who are therefore opening up spaces in other facilities so that we can have a flow through the housing continuum, to students, to low-income seniors, to people with disabilities, to immigrant families, to nurses and working class folks. And we have just this broad diversity of tenants. And I have also spent part of my time on the tenant advisory committee of the CRD. So I actually spend a lot of time with tenants, and I learn about their stories. And we are making it possible for a lot of people to live here. We're one of the most expensive regions in the entire country now. We've also had a lot of people who graduate from our buildings, who are in our buildings for 10 or 20 years. They save up money on a down payment. I just met a woman who did that. She was able to save money. She bought a condo. She opened up a unit in a building that someone else who has need has moved into. So we're also contributing to a flow in the housing continuum. So it's been hugely rewarding. I mean, non-market housing is really the only guaranteed way to have affordable housing. The market never quite does it on its own. I mean, certainly supply and demand do play a role, but there's a lot of other complicating factors in there. Whereas non-market housing is non-market housing, and it also becomes cheaper over time.
Regarding the idea of some kind of municipally led action on non-market housing, one of the councillors in Nanaimo at Monday's meeting alluded to the old adage that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Do you think that kind of holds water on this front, or do you think that the circumstances and the conditions of the present moment for building any kind of housing at all suggest that maybe won't hold up? There is some other model or some other thing that needs to be done now that is different than starting a corporation similar to other municipalities in BC?
Well, it's a good question. My first response is I'm curious as to why they don't want to take this on through the RDN. I would love to hear what their answer is for that, because you have access to a larger tax base and you also build consensus amongst the region, because some of the buildings might make sense to build in Cedar or in Ladysmith or something like that. I mean, what are some of the other towns in the RDN that are not coming? Parksville, maybe? Is Parksville in the RDN? I mean, not everything has to be in the city limits of Nanaimo, right? So I think it would be interesting to broaden the appeal, broaden the tax base. But aside from that, no, I don't think it's a bad idea to start now, because setting up a housing corporation will take years. And I think that the province of BC, we're all banking on the hope, the expectation that at some point CHF will get unpaused or some comparable program will come about. I don't really foresee the province of BC stopping permanently its investments in affordable housing. And the senior civil servants who I work with who've been around for 20 or 30 years always tell me that they've seen these cycles. It kind of goes in cycles and things get paused and unpaused. They always play the long game, a lot of those senior bureaucrats. So, let's just say the city of Nanaimo took the next 3 or 4 years to get a housing corporation off the ground. I think probably by then some capital program will have opened up and they'll be in a position to capture some of those resources. And maybe they are able to bring some equity to the table, right? The city of Nanaimo does own a lot of property. They've got parking lots and whatnot and public works and they have land, right? If you have land to bring to it and the city of Nanaimo says, we have land here. We have this acre, this underutilized parking lot. We have the staff to do this. We know how to, yes, we're new, but we've hired some people from other non-market housing providers and we know what we're doing now. The province of BC is more likely to invest and partner with you, right? Like the CRD, we are like the most reliable partner. We're right up there in the province. The BC Housing loves working with us because we've got miles of experience. Nanaimo won't have that experience, but definitely having a government backer builds confidence, right? Because there are a lot of little NGO nonprofits that pop up here and there and want to do housing. And the province is always skeptical, especially for the new ones, to get in bed with them because they don't necessarily have the equity. They don't have the experience. They don't have the capacity, but having a government backer helps. So yeah, I do think it's smart to try to build this up step by step. And maybe you get your first project going in 2030, right? Like I think it's unrealistic it's going to happen before that. But yeah, you got to plant the tree at some point. So if working it through the RDN is not possible, then I definitely see a rationale for proceeding just within the city limits and the municipal government. Yeah, I think it's smart, but I mean, there's definitely some big questions I would have.
Throughout our conversation, you've alluded to a number of details as regards the finances of a housing corporation like the one in the capital region. Just on a high level, is there anything you could say to people who might be concerned about in an era of rising property taxes and costs being downloaded onto municipalities about what the financial picture is like for your housing corporation as far as what kind of costs people have to bear and what kind of costs sort of become self-sustaining through tenant rents, or what like percentage of costs of construction, et cetera, come from provincial and federal partners?
Yeah, a very good question. I don't have the numbers right in front of me around requisition, but we don't use requisition that much for the Housing Corporation. There's other things that are much costlier, frankly. And that is because mainly the capital costs are being paid for by senior governments, and then we have rents, and those rents pay for a lot of our operations. But of course, we do have these subsidies, multi-decade subsidy agreements with the province. But the requisition sometimes is used around the edge to buttress the finances, so that's helpful, and that's through the CRD. At the city, as I noted, we have a housing reserve fund. The city of Victoria does not build affordable housing, but this term, I think we spent, off the top of my head, about $8 million on affordable housing. And the way that works is that, like, when the CRD is building or proposing a building inside the city limits of Victoria, which happens pretty regularly. We just finished Caledonia, Village on the Green is under construction, Michigan Square. There's a bunch of buildings. They'll come to the city and they'll say, do you want to co-invest? And we pretty much always say yes. So we'll give $1 million, 1.5. The most we've given is $2.5 million out of our housing reserve fund. So the housing reserve fund is mainly capitalized through developer contributions. There's a small percentage that comes from taxes, like to the tune of maybe a couple $100,000 per year, not big money. And those grants that we give to the CRD and other housing providers, it's not just the CRD, they help get projects over the line, because a lot of times it's challenging to close the equity gap. They're always talking about the equity gap when it comes to non-market housing, right? Like you're almost there to get the financing in place, and you need another $1 million or $2 million, and that's where the cities step up. Saanich has a similar housing reserve fund. So again, like, this is one where you'd want to talk to Don Elliott, who's our senior civil servant that runs the Housing Corporation. But based on my understanding of the finances, which are pretty good, it's not a major drain on taxpayers. I mean, I guess ultimately the capital grants that come from BC Housing fall, on provincial taxpayers. So, at the end of the day, eventually this gets back to taxes writ large. But when it comes to like property taxes or requisition through a regional district, our housing corporation is not a major burden on people, largely because the capital costs come from elsewhere, and then the rents. I mean, I will note, I know I saw it in the news, but we recently gave ourselves the authority at the CRD to borrow up to $85 million to build more affordable housing. So, that debt servicing would likely in part come from requisition. But that $85 million allows us to leverage, in theory, federal and provincial dollars with some of our properties that have relatively low density that could be redeveloped, because we have equity to leverage. So the $85 million is sort of thrown into the mix there. Because we just announced this ambitious project. We're trying to build an additional, we have 1,000 units in the works right now, but we want to build another 2,000 beyond that to bring our total number of homes to 5,000 by 2045. So we call it the CRD 2045 plan. And so that involves $85 million of requisition. So yeah, some of that would get back to debt that comes back to taxpayers. But honestly, this is not a big driver of tax increases in our region at all. Like, pales in comparison to police, inflation, climate impacts, etc. It also hasn't become particularly politicized. I don't get emails complaining about people's tax dollars going towards affordable housing. On the contrary, I hear that people want more of it, or they want deeper subsidy. That's, like I said, the big criticism right now is that affordable housing is not affordable enough. So no, I think like the political risks are actually relatively low. There's a big upside politically. I think the challenge is figuring out the finances and the capacity.
Well, Jeremy Caradonna, we're out of time. I got to leave you there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Jeremy Caradonna is a Victoria City Councillor and Vice Chair of the Capital Region Housing Corporation. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, you can email us at news@chly.ca. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. That's all for now. We'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
This program gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.